I think in the world there is this feeling that we can still be comfortable and meet the goals that we need to meet to fight climate change being the worst possible outcome. And we can't. Scientifically, we can't. For example, raise your hand if you saw this little tiny piece of news that all the glaciers on Greenland are done. There's no chance of them. Raise your hand. I just want to see who here actually read that. Yeah, huge, right? Huge piece of news. We aren't talking about it. But that's the situation that we're in, and biodiversity loss being 3 times past the actual planetary boundary. So it's not sensational anymore. This is the environment that we're in. Textiles being one of the greatest contributors in an industry that has never been regulated globally. So that's the context. The last thing I want to say, as an academic, I'm always looking for the truth of everything, what's the best way to do something, and I have the freedom and luxury and time to do that. In legislation, you don't. So I will never, ever present a piece of legislation that is perfect. But you have to start somewhere. This is one of the most elegant pieces of legislation that I've ever worked on. It's been rewritten like 9,000 times. And I'm sure, every time I do a speaking engagement, I have a couple other ideas from the audience. So I wanted to do this in the context of the circular economy. I'm going to speed through these, though, because this is all your area of expertise, or at least clearly an area of passion for you. The thing that I really appreciated about this, though, is the last section where it says, is regenerative by design and aims to gradually decouple growth from the consumption of finite resources. Wonderful book that's been around for a while, that is prosperity without growth concept. And that's something that I love about the circular economy, because of course all economies are based on consumption. Yeah, maybe we're not going to get fully out of that mentality right away, but the idea of having closed loop systems, to me, I find very rewarding, creating the jobs, creating the economy, but not pulling on more and more natural resources. So again, this is a very complicated, complex slide from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation of what the circular economy is. So again, you are all very familiar with it. I will skip through, but just knowing that our goal with this piece of legislation, decrease in energy consumption, greenhouse gas emissions, water and air pollution, habitat destruction, and climate change. Those are the goals, very lofty goals, of this piece of legislation. I'm going to go through a couple facts. The textile industry is one of the highest consumers of energy, water, raw materials, and farmland, and one of the greatest contributors to air pollution, biodiversity loss, climate change. A big culprit. So a couple slides on the facts. Again, I'm just going to read these with you so that you don't have to both listen to me and read at the same time, which is really disconcerting. Textiles are the 4th largest cause of environmental pressure after food, housing, and transportation, right? We don't walk around naked. We live in houses for the most part we want to. We have to move back and forth, and we have to eat 3 times a day in the ideal setting. Of course, those would be the things that would be the greatest contributors. The fashion industry is responsible for a significant share of global water pollution, consumes more energy than shipping and aviation combined. That's a great image, right? So that we think about the magnitude. And by 2050 is anticipated to be responsible for 25% of the world's remaining carbon budget. Furthermore, our clothes release 500,000 tons of microfibers into the ocean every year. I wanted to make sure everybody here walks away knowing one piece of fact is that about 50% of all the plastic in the ocean, we see the whales with their gut full, or the seagulls, but it's actually microplastics that are about 50%, the things you can't see, that work their way up the entire supply or food chain. Farmland and biodiversity. Fashion is a significant contributor to global deforestation, with around 150 million trees logged every year to be turned into cellulosic fibers, viscose. And the fashion industry is projected to use 35% more land for fiber production by 2030. 35% more in the next 25 years. According to the UN, to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, emissions must be reduced by 50% in the next 6.5 years. The United States, in the last presidency, went in the wrong direction. We increased by 2%. Now we are trying to undo that and head in the other direction even further. Gives you a sense. We have 6.5 years. That's what I mean by it's not about how we can change our behaviors and stay in the comfortable way we have of living. In particular, convenience is the priority of the Industrial Revolution that we have been perfecting. I think we need a new goal. We need a new priority. It's no longer convenience, right? The textile industry is responsible for up to 8% of all GHG emissions. So we cannot reach these 50% reduction goals unless we include the textile industry. We cannot. That's my point. So fashion industry, child labor. 2 facts that I want you to take home. This industry is the second highest for child labor. It's also in the top 5 for slave labor, stolen wages. 10-fold increase in US clothing waste to landfills from 1960 to 2018. Why I'm putting these is because I wanted to make it clear that we are heading in the absolute wrong direction. There are about 92 million tons of textiles that are landfilled every year, 92 million tons per year. 20 million comes from China, 17 million comes from the United States. We're the 2 greatest consumers, but we have about 1/5 of the population that China has. And we only have 3 million less tons per year, just to give you a sense of the impact of the United States, which is why this piece of legislation is so profoundly important. This, of course, being one of the most important, the gray being what is landfilled. And you can see from the 1960s to 2018, the massive trend. You do see an increase in combustion with energy recovery, not a long-term solution because of the GHG emissions. You don't really see composting, you see some recycling. Everything flattening out to some extent, but the rate of increase is less, but it is still increasing. The Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, you'll hear us say OECD. How many people are familiar with the OECD? Oh, wonderful, 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 right? So they are the drivers of this concept called due diligence. So what is the Fashion Act in this context? It is one of the first pieces of legislation in the United States that uses this due diligence model. Why I think that it is so important is I'm an epidemiologist by training, so we're systems thinkers by nature. We know that everything is interconnected and we are absolutely messy. Nature is messy. So you have to think of everything from every angle and not linearly. And that's what a due diligence model recognizes. It says, what are all of the factors contributing? Measure everything, take into consideration the impact, implement change, reduce risk. The other thing, as I have here, risk-based hybrid model. Why this is so important is because we are looking for all the factors that have the greatest risk in contributing to those labor violations that we are seeing and the environmental issues that we're seeing, and we want to reduce them. This bill requires that the brands directly measure them and that they are responsible to continuously reduce those risks over time, and they can't search around the edges to find the areas from the get-go that have the least risk, that are the most green or the most labor-friendly, and then focus on reducing those. They have to prioritize identifying and reporting on those areas that have the greatest risk. Hugely important. The other thing that's important about this bill that makes this bill sort of due diligence 2.0, and why I put it here, is because due diligence has gotten a reputation of being a reporting transparency only. But this bill also requires direct measurements, reporting of those measurements, and it's the first time that there is a bill that has a true enforcement piece if those measures, if reduction in those risks are not met. So step 1, what the model is designed as, mapping a seller's supply chain. There are 4 tiers within a supply chain. So tier 1, that has 12 months to map this out. Tier 2, 2 years. Tier 3 and 4, 3 years. 75% of tier 1 needs to be mapped out as with tier 2, and 50% minimum, 50% tier 3 and 4. So this goes all the way from the production of the material down to, for example, the farming and harvesting and selling then in tier 4 of raw materials. But this is the establishment of the raw materials. This is the step where this is the mapping of the actual data. This is the amount of data, so finding and then mapping all of the direct measures of greenhouse gas emissions, the impact on water quality, and we're using, this is the other thing that's really important, we are using international standards, so we have not created new methods of data collection in this bill. That is hugely important because this piece of legislation needs to be comparable and coordinated with what's happening in the European Union. So the European Union just passed a piece of legislation where they are now committed to regulate this industry. Hugely important. But what would be horrible for brands is if they had one criteria for regulating, we had another form of criteria, and every single state had a different form of regulating. We have to be coordinated, and that is intentional in this piece of legislation. So using international standards of direct measures. So very quickly then, this due diligence, what it means, measuring, setting and achieving science-based climate targets, those are the direct measures. sample and report waste chemical concentrations and water usage, track implementation and results of all the above efforts, and provide for or cooperate in remediation. Brands must be part of the solution, not passing on all the responsibility onto their supply chain. Have to take into consideration, for example, the impact when a brand puts in an order and then 3 weeks before the order is due, changing that order completely, saying, well, we need it 2 weeks earlier, we need it 1 week later, oh, and we need this different number, and oh, we're using this different design. Oh, and that's no longer in mode anymore, and so now we are completely changing it. That leads to factories not being able to pay their workers, because everything that's already been done, of course, they throw that away, start over again, for example. So brands have a real responsibility to look at their own practices and how they're influencing what is happening through the entire supply chain. And that's what I mean by not a one-way street. Brands also have responsibility. They have to report on what they're doing. They have to report not only what's happening through the supply chain, but then what decisions are they making, not only to influence the quality of the work through that supply chain, the environmental impacts, the labor impacts, but even if they decide to pull out of working with a factory, what steps did they take to responsibly pull out, to make sure that that labor got paid before they pull out? Right? That is really important. The Act includes detailed language on purchasing practices, as I just described, so that they can be responsible. So reporting, regulation, and verification, and this is where it gets really detailed, and this bill diverges from some historical due diligence pieces of legislation. The reporting, I've already broken down to you really quickly, but it's important to note that the reporting in this bill will go to the Attorney General. Very important. Step 4 is all of the details of what needs to be reported, how it's going to be reported. All of that will be determined after the bill passes. And I do want to make it clear, there is a profound difference between legislation and regulation, and a lot of people don't understand this. If I put every single detail into a piece of legislation of exactly how it needs to be implemented, once that passes, that's in law. Any single time that I want to change that, I'd have to go back and change the law. You do not want to do that, because look at the political capital that I've had to put so far, 2 years, into building an entire coalition to get this done. So there's always a balance on how much you leave to be regulated. You set agencies specifically to do that, and then oversight. You track them, watch them, and if there needs to be changes, you can do that through legislation, but it gives a little bit more flexibility. Step 5, verification. Super important. The Department of State will work to, all of the data will need to be independently verified. Hugely important in this, and there will be a process set in place to certify the verifiers. Because of course you don't want to create a situation where the verifiers are paid for by the brands. They're not independent, so they will have to prove that they are independent in order to be allowed to verify the information. Step 6, last piece, is enforcement. The New York Attorney General will annually publish and make available the list of fashion sellers who are known to be out of compliance. They'll be given 3 months to get into compliance. This is an immediate slap of they have to deal with the consequences, but they will have those 3 months. If they choose to continue to be out of compliance, then the Attorney General can fine them up to 2% of their gross global income. So that is the piece that is showing, right, there are consequences. And it does outline in the bill how you can reduce your risk over time, and it must be substantive. It can't be, I've measured, and we have one more person who made a living wage. Therefore, there was an impact. See, you can't fine us. No, it has to be substantive, and in the regulation will determine what substantive precisely means. Any of the funds collected through the fining process will create a community benefit fund, and that money, which will be monitored and controlled by the state comptroller, so that creates transparency, will be used to compensate for the negative consequences of the actions by the brands. They're on the website. If you go to thefashionact.org, there is a link to the actual bill if you want to read it. I have become a super dork with legislation. Some of them are written really poorly. Some of them are tremendously elegant. I think this bill is very elegant, so encourage people to review it. There are a ton of supporters. I think there are over 100 supporters on the list of collaborators. This is literally just the top part of the website. It continues to scroll. But we have worked very hard with all of our collaborators to get to the language that everybody can finally support. These are all of the ones that we have been working with. Some of them have officially signed off on the actual language. Some of them we're still working with. But this shows you have to get buy-in. You have to get buy-in to get something through like this, because this is literally game changer in the industry. Last, a couple take-home points. The EU this spring officially voted to regulate the fashion industry globally, and this is really important, particularly for Americans in the room. We either can choose to be at the table or not, but this is a train that's already moving. This is the first piece of legislation in the United States that would regulate the industry. Once we introduce this bill, there are 4 other states that have introduced it. We have ideas about coordinating. They are being respectful of this process. They're waiting for us to work through it. And my hope is that we will build either formal collaborations, which we are talking about, or that they will take this model that we've done, and then we can mentor them through so that they are coordinated. But either way, we are in active conversations, because that, again, as I said, very, very, very important. A couple things just to circle this back into the circular economy. This is what's happening in the United States. This is why it's so important. We are going in the wrong direction. We are absolutely going in the wrong direction. This is just a 15-year period. 15-year period that we have seen a doubling truckloads of clothing that are landfilled in the United States. Truckload. So it has doubled just in 15 years. Fashion in the circular economy, again, everyone here knows this. This is creativity, this is innovation, this is, I believe, how we should define fashion. Fashion is what everybody thinks is sexy at the time. That's messaging, that's a drive. If circular economy is what is sexy, that will be how our clothes will be made. So it is up to us in the room to make the fashion that we know is aligned with the circular economy what is sexy. I will just sort of end on that. Examples of solutions, upcycled clothing. I just wanted to show these. Those are gorgeous. They're gorgeous. It's what we choose. We drive it, right? The influencers. So final key takeaways. To make fundamental change towards a truly sustainable system, we do need legislative action underneath it. And part of that is that we have to create an equal playing field, because the brands that are trying to move forward are at a continuous disadvantage. And there are many that are. So if we do not have that floor across the board, then there will never be a full transformation within the industry.